School safety has been the topic of discussion this semester. It erupted across the nation after the February 14th Florida school shooting, which killed 14 students and 3 teachers.
I love you. I love you. It's going to be fine. Can you hide somewhere? Can you play dead?
It was a parent's worst nightmare.
If he shoots, we need to play dead.
The day gunman, Nicholas Cruz, opened fire inside Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, sending students and teachers in a panic.
Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School is being shot up.
It's being shot up.
Some hiding inside closets and bathrooms to escape deadly gunfire.
I can't hear you. Are you at the school?
Now, in the weeks since the Florida shooting, schools across the country have been receiving an onslaught of copycat threats. According to the Educator School Safety Network, more than 1,400 school-based incidents and threats have been made since the Florida school attack. That's roughly 1,800 schools across the nation impacted since then. And 46% of those threats involved actual guns, while 45% were made through social media. And it's happening here in Western Montana. Just this semester, a Darby High School student was accused of making threats through the social media app Snapchat. The Charlotte School District investigated a note containing a bomb threat, and shots were fired when a Big Sky student attempted to run over a school resource officer. Over the past 4 months, schools across Western Montana have found themselves dealing with school safety incidents, and all eyes are on administrators to find solutions. So what are schools doing in the case of an act of violence? Well, I traveled to Polson, where teachers and district leaders are prepping for any life-threatening situation.
All right, ceasefire, stop. Get up. Everybody okay? You all right?
Kristen Wilson, the principal at Linderman Elementary, says a safe place to go to school is the first step in a healthy learning environment.
I think the number one important thing we have to remember is that we just need a plan. And so if we aren't educated on what the best practices are and what research says will keep kids safe best, then we actually really aren't doing our job.
Oh my God, everybody, hold on. Let's check it. Leak up.
And hardening schools has been at the forefront of this school safety discussion. In the aftermath of the Parkland shooting, President Trump said one solution to school shootings is arming teachers. He added, when we declare our schools to be gun-free zones, it just puts our students in far more danger. And although arming educators is still an idea, Polson High School teacher Adrian Barnes is very aware of the amount of stress teachers already have.
There is a ton of pressure, and I think it's already a job where you have to wear so many different hats, and here you have to add another one about trying to not just provide for the emotional security of your students, but also the physical security of your students. How do I keep them safe? Because they are why I do this job. They are my passion and my love and my, everything that you want to give everything that you can for the kids. But it's a lot like one more thing on your plate that, how do I keep them safe?
Politics aside, these teachers spent a day learning how to disarm a suspect, self-defense, and how to react in different safety scenarios, which is something Polson Superintendent Rex Welch says is a starting point.
For all of us that are in this business in any public organization, we really want to do is get out of that scenario, get out of that environment. So you're going to run. If you can't do that, get yourself locked down best you can, get out of sight. And then at all costs, if those two don't work, then fight. And so the run, lock, fight is the principles, national standards that all organizations are working under.
Schools not only have to find a better way to protect their students, but also more effectively communicate with parents. It's been a semester of questions without answers, especially for these parents who drop their kids off each day, expecting they'll come home alive. So I sat down with 5 parents from different parts of Western Montana to talk about these issues. Randy Stemple, a parent to a Big Sky sophomore. Julie Merritt, a mother of 2 boys in Missoula. Brett Butler, a father of 2 kids in the Polson School District. Elizabeth Langley, the mother of twin daughters attending Big Fork High School. And Jeff Rolston Clemmer, a parent to 3 students in the Missoula County Public School System. All of them different walks of life with different political views. However, the one thing they have in common is they want their kids to be safe in school. how have you addressed this at home, and how have you addressed these issues of mass shootings, school threats, and just what's been going on in the news, in the atmosphere right now? How have you addressed that at home? And we can start with Elizabeth here.
Sure. You know, I have 2 girls that are seniors at Big Fork High School. So we talk openly. We always have since they were little enough. You know, they share their concerns, their fears. You know, just making sure that when they are in a classroom, if something were to happen, that they would be safe. What was their route? You know, these are things that are in their minds, unfortunately. So we just really have open dialogue. You know, I try to put them at ease, let them know that they are safe, that they're smart and capable, and just hope for the best.
What about you, Randy? How have you addressed this at home?
Well, I try to keep it in perspective with my daughter. While the school incidents tend to take high priority in the news, they're a pretty minor and pretty far off chance of anything happening. So my daughter originally was part of she has a lot of anxiety, and she was really worried about the graffiti threats at Big Sky. But when we talked to her about the possibility of something happening, how often something actually does happen, it really calms her down a little bit, to the point where when the last one happened, she was more irritated that she was having to deal with it than worried about it. And I think one of the problems that we have, if we act like this is an epidemic that's getting out of control, then our kids lose their ability to really enjoy life. They start worrying about things too much, and you got to keep things in perspective. So that's what we try to do at our house.
How about you, Julia? How do you address this at home?
Well, I would say my boys are 12 and 14 now. It's a little easier this time around. When Sandy Hook happened, they were kindergarten and 2nd grade, and it was really difficult to figure out how to bring that up with them. But you had to say something because you knew that the other kids were going to be talking about it at school. So when the news first came out about Parkland, we talked about it. My boys, you know, expressed some of the concerns that they have about, you know, what's going on in our world around us. And I just, you know, let them know that whenever they have concerns, that there's adults around them that they're able to talk to.
And same for you, Brett.
Well, I have 2 kids that are different in age and at different schools, so we approached it 2 different ways. My younger son, we addressed it with just not being afraid to report, to go to adults and be able to talk about things they hear with their kids, classmates and so on. My older daughter, the same sort of principle, just make sure to know that there are reporting procedures you can go to, just to not really stay vigilant, but she's a very social person anyway, so she talks to a lot of kids, she talks to a lot of adults, she has a pretty good open dialogue with everyone, just to not be afraid to report things that may be out of the ordinary. Just, you know, she doesn't like her feelings hurt, and same for their friends. So when it came time to the walkout, which I believe is 5 weeks old today, the shooting anniversary, we talked to her about probably the best way to memorialize them. I mean, she can feel bad for the kids, obviously, that passed away. We didn't try to diminish that in any way, but to also not to, I guess, be afraid of going to school for any reason. She loves school so much that we really didn't want to diminish that in any way. That trust in the adults that are there. So she found some security in that and dealt with it her own way. So.
And Jeff, what about you? How did you address this at home with your kids?
Well, my kids, I feel pretty lucky. My kids are not, they're not terribly worried, I must say. And so, you know, we've checked in with them to see how they're feeling, and I think that they're like probably most kids who don't have, you know, until something happens to them, they don't really see that it's a reality. So the other thing that we've done, though, is just check with them and see if they feel secure with the safety plans that are in place at the schools.
Yeah. So we talk about, you know, when your kids are at school, to Brett was saying, report something that you see that might be a little bit out of the ordinary. What would you like to see then if your kids are reporting something? What would you like to see from your school administrators or kind of the leaders in your school where your kids are attending? Elizabeth?
I would like to see follow through because that is an issue. Of course, every school in every part of the country. But I would like to see follow through because I do know that a lot of times things are reported to a teacher or some other school personnel, or even teachers will witness some issues. But I feel like in most cases the follow through just kind of stops. They might check in with a situation and feel it's situation specific and then move on to the next crisis that might come up. So I would really just like to see more of a long-term follow-through with these issues.
What about you, Randy? What would you like to see from, let's talk about the Big Sky incident real quick, because your kids go to Big Sky, correct? Mm-hmm. I know that they sent out emails and they were alerting. How did you feel about that form of communication from the school?
So I will address that I think a lot of parents were frustrated with the communication, but I don't have an expectation that the school's going to be able to get the information out as fast as the kids that are on social media that are instantaneously getting out. Clearly they have to compose their message to get it out, but there's a communication aspect to this that isn't just the immediate communication. One of the things that happened going back to the graffiti threats at Big Sky is when they had the very first one, they addressed it with the kids and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have 2 SRO officers in the school. We're going to do these things. And that was one of the things that was really frustrating for my daughter is she never saw the second SRO officer. Now maybe he was there in plain clothes, but they didn't communicate that to the kids, and so she didn't feel like the school was following through on what they said they were going to do. And so it's not just following through on the threats, but it's if they're going to communicate something that they're going to do, to go ahead and do that, and so that the kids or the parents know that that's what's being done. The last incident with the SRO shooting, that I felt that was communicated very well by the school. I know there were a lot of parents that didn't think so because they didn't feel like they got the information for an hour, but if you think of how long it takes for that incident to occur, it's going to be an hour before you get any information out. So I do think that communication is the key, and then following through with what you say you're going to do.
What about you, Jeff? What would you like to see from school administrators?
Well, I think that my feeling is that the kids can take away, when there is not good communication, especially with the kids, then they have all sorts of ideas about what is happening and what isn't happening. And I think that would be my biggest frustration, is that the kids are kind of confused about what's happening, and the idea that they shouldn't be sharing the information with the kids is somewhat frustrating. So I think that they're all big enough, that they can handle. I mean, obviously it's more critical for grade schoolers than for high schoolers what you're going to share with them. But even my daughter, I think, who's my youngest, is able to handle information and would prefer to know what's actually going on and not jump to conclusions.
So we have a level of transparency that you want to see from your school administrators. Julie, what kind of transparency would you like to see? Because you don't want a school that's telling you every little detail, right? Or do you want that? I mean, do you really want to know every little detail, or do you want there to be some level of transparency? I guess, what would you like to see with transparency?
Well, that's a good question. I see the MCPS has a lot of ways that they communicate with parents. And I definitely have experienced the times when there's a mountain lion in Patty Canyon and I get an email, a text message, I get a push notification on the app on my phone, and I get a phone call all about that. But then there's been some other more critical things that have happened that have not been communicated that way, and I'm not sure who's all involved in making those decisions. I do think that when it's something that's critical, one of the things about the Big Sky, the graffiti incident that seemed out of sync with the communication was that there was information shared with a news outlet apparently before the parents were notified. And that to me was maybe not the right order to do things in. That we should have gotten, the parents should have been informed before it came out, you know, on the news organizations' their Facebook feed.
So there's a ton of different ways we can get information: emails, text messaging, alerts, push notifications. I used to work up in Polson. Brett, what kind of form of communication would you like with school administrators?
Unfortunately, I think it's sort of a multifaceted problem, because on one hand, the school administrators have, in some cases, a responsibility to inform when certain things do happen on the school grounds. But you know, just in our middle school alone, we have hundreds of students. There's probably 2,000 or 3,000 different social networking accounts just between the students at the school. So there's a time-sensitive crunch when something happens, because word is going to spread, even in a small town like Polson, and it's going to get to the parents sometimes before even the administrators have had a chance to refine their message and get it out. But at the same time, as a parent, and I look at it from two different ways, from working in the schools as well as being a parent of students, that I do want to be informed, but there are so many, sometimes what certain people might call minor incidents, and of course then there's sometimes major incidents. And those do eventually make it out to the public. And we have robocalls and certain ways of getting out from the superintendent to the school administrators, to sometimes they just do a robocall with a set message letting everybody know. Sometimes letters come home as well. But they might not be for a day or two after the incident. By then it's on Facebook or Instagram or something like that, or it might even be on the news depending upon the incident. And it's almost rumor control at that point, that you have to sort of dispel myths from your kids hearing from one person to another to, luckily I worked in the schools, my family works in the schools, so we get straight from the horse's mouth sometimes, but other times it's kept from people that work in the schools just to prevent those sort of things from happening. So it's a very fine line that they've got to cross and sometimes get out to the parents. And we're not the biggest of schools. I mean, we really, honest to goodness, do not have this student population that Big Sky and several different towns do have. So it's kind of an uphill battle. I don't know if there's one set parameter that would work universally for all the schools, but I would like to see a little bit more transparency and a little bit better informed decisions made by the administration at times. But I do understand that some things don't need to be broadcast to everybody. It just invokes panic sometimes.
Exactly. We don't want to, cause mayhem.
Of course.
Something that could just be between the adults, I guess. Okay, so kind of moving on here. Do you feel like, since you guys have been to school, that there's a new age of school safety? Do you feel like, I mean, when I went to school, and this was just not too long ago, I didn't even think twice about school safety. I didn't even think twice about walkouts, these demonstrations. I was just a kid going to school. How has that changed for you guys as parents? I mean, has things changed drastically from when you went to school? Jeff?
Yeah, it's just ridiculous how much it's changed. I mean, I think about, I think that we had fire drills, and there were occasional weather events or something, that would concern people. But the whole idea of kids bringing weapons to school, it's just, the campus was completely open when I was in high school, and there was zero concern. So it's a world of difference. And yeah, I think that's one of the things that's hard for me, is catching up on, so what are you doing to prepare for kids? I have no frame of reference.
If we all have different opinions, right, and where we think what schools could be doing, what local government could be doing, what communities can be doing to prevent these issues, there's a lot of different talks of school safety, security increase, more SROs on campus. There's also talks of gun reform. There's also talks of more money into mental health care. I guess, what is what is the answer, if there is an answer? Randy?
Well, there's definitely not one answer. I think that's the problem. Everybody looks for the quick fix. What's the one thing that we can do to fix this? And the trend lately is not a trend that just started this year. It's a gradual, movement that's happened, and we can look to a lot of societal changes for why it's happened. One of the things I think that's probably been a problem is the lack of education. We're educating our kids on a lot broader subjects, but just as an example, when I was growing up, gun safety was actually a part of the school program. And quite frankly, we had shooting teams in high school. I mean, you talk about the changes in the schools. We brought our hunting rifles to school with us. They were in the car. After school, we went hunting, You can't have a gun on campus. You can't have one in the parking lot. If you have it on the street, and you're parked on the city street even, it can be a problem. So there's definitely a change there. And one of the things that's frustrating for me is an organization that I belong to, we provide gun safety training to 1st through 3rd graders, and we have a hard time getting into the school district #1 schools. Nobody, as soon as you mention gun, there's a fear that it's a pro-gun thing. There's estimates that 90% of the households in Montana have guns in them, and your kids are probably going to come into contact with a gun at some point. And so we provide a certified teacher to go into schools and teach 1st through 3rd graders, should you encounter a gun, this is what you need to do, and give them the safety training. But the schools are just not engaging in that anymore. And so consequently, not every school shooting is a planned shooting. You have kids bringing a gun to school to show it off and it accidentally goes off. There's lots of different things that happen that way. So I think there's an educational aspect that's definitely missing in all this.
And now, so when we have those educational purposes and you bring guns into school, there's going to obviously be backlash from parents who don't want their kids to be handling a gun in school. Does anyone feel like that here, that maybe they just don't want their kids to even be around guns? Or are we all opposed? Are we all in agreement that maybe we could see training in guns in schools? Or does anyone disagree with that opinion, I guess?
I don't know if training, like actually physically having the guns at the school, I guess I hadn't really thought about that before, but my gut reaction is I'm not so sure about that, but I think that there is a lot of education that we could do with both the kids and adults around guns that would make safer communities and therefore safer schools. Certainly talking about what to do if you come upon a gun, but adults need to be trained that guns need to be kept locked, unloaded, and separate from the ammunition, and keep them out of the hands of our children, unless they're there to be shooting a gun at a target range or out hunting, or when it's appropriate.
And so how do you distinguish that idea of appropriateness, like bringing a gun to school? Like you said, like back in the day, I grew up in North Dakota. I mean, it's a lot similar to North Dakota, to Montana here, but I had friends who brought their shotguns to school as well. That was kind of just the norm in a smaller school, but I feel like that shift has changed immensely since even when I was in school. Elizabeth, you have kids in Big Fork High School. What's kind of the dynamic there?
It's the same for me. I actually graduated from Big Fork as well. So I was we were kind of on the opposite ends, but having a discussion with a former high school classmate after the shooting in Florida. So he was saying the same thing, like what happened when we were in high school, all of them had their rifles and their trucks, and we were not afraid, and that's true. I was not afraid, but it has changed, and there is fear now, so that's what needs to be addressed. Kind of like they've said up there, there is not one answer. There's not one answer, but I strongly believe we need to listen to the students on both sides, because they are the ones that are living in this every day, and maybe they have some answers that we can all kind of agree upon on both sides.
So before I had you guys come here, I kind of asked for you guys to just throw your guys' opinions on what you thought on what was going on politically in the atmosphere right now. And there was also some of you that talked about security at schools. Maybe it's a one single point entry, one door that's opened at the beginning of school and it's closed the rest of the day until the end of the day. I guess what would you like to see as school security issue, Brett?
Well, I think there's definitely some rules on the books district-wide and school policy that could probably use some better enforcement. Whether or not some things need to be added to those is up to, I guess, the area in which the schools are located in. Again, I don't think there's a universal set of rules that would work and apply to every school, because I'm pretty sure Polson, for example, doesn't require the same sort of stringent off-campus policies that, say, LA schools or New Jersey or Florida, for example, have, just due to the amount of students and the amount of traffic that they get. But I think to try and help curb the fear, you know, the kids these days in the schools living with the day-to-day news and events that are happening, kids today have access to a 24/7 news feed that we had to go searching for, even in my day. But thanks to being trained up the way I've been trained from my father and my parents, learning and familiarization with firearms and so on, and competition shoots and very controlled circumstances, and with the rules and regulations that we had in these competitions. The first time I ever encountered a firearm was actually a freshman in high school, and it was in the locker room. A kid brought a .45 pistol to school, was showing it off, and I managed to take the barrel out of the gun, and without him even knowing it, taking it to the principal, and they tried to punish me for possessing the barrel, saying that I must have known something about it, because they couldn't fathom the fact that I was able to break down a pistol, disarm it completely, and make it completely inert without being some sort of involvement in the situation. So I think familiarization and training to the kids, to the adults, would go a long way in curbing what they see on social media all the time. These different scenarios and situations by a lot of their idols that sometimes they're glorified by doing some of these things, and they see it on Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook, and it's 24 hours accessible to some of these kids. I think if we enforced better policies about making sure they didn't have their cell phones while they were in class, and if they are possessing them for whatever reason, they're turned off and put away. I'm sure I speak for most people up here on this panel that the ability to find information was still accessible in our day. We didn't require a cell phone in the school to be able to get it. Kids these days have absolutely no idea what a card catalog is or a Dewey Decimal System or any of that. Some of them aren't even taught how to read or write cursive anymore. I don't know how they could even read the Constitution. So I think if we emphasized a little bit more education on addressing those issues, some of this as a side effect would actually be curbed.
Yeah.
So,
Jeff, what do you see? Would you like to see? How do you think we can prevent school threats, school violence, mass shootings? I mean, obviously there's not one answer, and we're not going to solve the answers of the world in KPAX studio, right? Like, this is the beginning of a discussion, hopefully. Right. But I mean, what would you like to see?
Well, honestly, I feel like I'm a little frustrated that we aren't doing more to address. I feel like there's a lobby, a gun lobby or a gun manufacturer's lobby, that their answer is always, well, there should be more guns. And the purchase of more guns is, that's gonna be what we solve, and it feels as if that's all we've been doing. And I think that there's so many common sense things that can happen. I mean, again, hunter safety was a huge thing when I was a kid, and I think by making background checks. I mean, I do not understand why we're not doing this. So I'm very frustrated with the political climate, I have to say. It seems like a no-brainer to me. And then I think we can. I mean, I'm very impressed with Missoula County Public Schools, the renovations of the schools, and I think they are thinking about safety, and things are changing in regard to that, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've sort of allowed the conversation to be taken over by one side, and you know, the unfortunate part is that a lot of our lawmakers are only listening to that one side, and that is extremely frustrating. It sounds to me as if the majority of Americans would like to see common sense gun control, and so you know, so I'm frustrated.
Yeah, common sense gun control. I mean, that's something that has been talked about for as long as I can remember, but especially recently with the Florida school shooting, people get so polarized with that topic. And so how do you go about that? Randy, do you know, what are your thoughts on common sense gun control? You seem like a guy that's
it seems like a good term to throw out there, common sense gun control, but when we start talking about it, we start getting into some pretty deep weeds. And one of the things that I think is interesting out of this conversation is, especially with the kids involved in the conversation, is this thought that we need to push the age limit up to 21. We got to get that age limit up to 21. These are adults. These are kids that at 17 can sign up and go into the military, and they're voting away a right that they have in the Constitution. And I find that interesting that that's the solution, is we just need to change the age limit. We're taking away the responsibility of the kids to be responsible for anything at a young age, and now we're just pushing them back to becoming adults to a later age. And that is where the education thing comes in. We need to start having these kids be responsible at a younger age so they understand what responsibility is, instead of saying you can't do this until you're 21, you can't do this until you're 21. And so we have background checks already. We can look at the Parkland shooting as a perfect example of all the balls that got dropped from the school to the law enforcement to the FBI. The things that should have gotten taken care of didn't get taken care of. So you could have enacted all the gun laws you wanted and you wouldn't have stopped this. And the fact of the matter, I think one of the things we have to wrap our head around is that bad people exist. There are people out there who are going to want to do harm, as we have in the package bomber that was just killed himself this morning. Mm-hmm. So if people want to do bad, they're going to do bad. The gun is a tool, a bomb can be a tool, a knife can be a tool. We have to address the issue on a different plane and figure out what's causing these people to want to do bad. And that's the way to address it, in my opinion.
And I mean, the issue of what is causing this is really why we're all here. I mean, to sit down and talk and discuss this. Where do you think that issue lies, Julie?
Well, I think that we could do a lot more to teach our kids about, from a very young age, about respecting themselves, respecting each other, teaching them more critical thinking skills and better coping skills. I mean, you're going to get angry with people, but if we don't teach them what to do with that anger, or you're going to get disappointed when your girlfriend breaks up with you. If we don't teach them how to cope with those emotions, and then they blow up, or they behave in a way that we don't like. I think that in our schools, in the past, when we didn't have instant access to all of this information, the content that we were teaching kids at school was necessary. But now, they can look up 99% of what they're getting taught in class on Google in less than a minute. I think we need to move away from some of that content and work more on teaching them some of these good pro-social skills and how to go about problem solving, and just really give them more tools to work with.
Yeah, and how do you address that then? Do you address that through school administrators, or do you address that through lawmakers who make it a point that these issues have to be taught in school?
I think it starts at the home all the way up. I think it's, like I said earlier, it's a multifaceted issue. So, when a drunk driver hits somebody, unfortunately, and kills them, do we blame the car or do we blame the driver? You know, when a child texting while driving, unfortunately, hits somebody or has an accident, we don't blame the car. We pointed at the problem. And there are laws on the books that prevent those things from happening, but if they're not followed, then obviously bad things happen. I don't understand why so many times when something like this happens that we point the finger at the gun and not the person. Like you said, there are bad people out there. I've seen this from a teacher standpoint, a parent issue, law enforcement background, as well as a veteran. And for people to talk about raising the age, for example, on buying firearms, well, it's like you said, they're voting away a right that they have. And if you can vote, if you can sign up for the military, as I did at that age, and be issued a rifle, I don't understand why you can't go into Walmart and buy one. You still have to do the same background checks. You still have to pass the same stringent laws that you do to join the military and so on. I had a completely clear background check and then applied to work in the schools, had to go through another one. And it's the same background checks that our SROs go through when they protect the schools, and anybody's able to do that. But I think if you start at the home and start really monitoring the games that they play on PlayStation or any other gaming network, if you start monitoring what they're looking at on your surfaces and your computers and their smartphones, you know, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of things that glorify things like this, and even my 8-year-old has come to me and sung songs that I had to be 18 to hear when I was his age. There's just no way. Yeah. But they have accessibility now to these things, and if you don't counter that with parenting at home or some sort of guidance, they become the norm and they become desensitized when something like this happens at school. They don't know how to act. Relationships break up, and you know, you add to that puberty and growing up in the day that we're living in, there's a whole slew of emotions that these poor kids unfortunately are just trying to deal with, and sometimes don't have those avenues at home, look for it at the schools or look for it in some sort of parental figure, and if that opportunity isn't taken, sometimes these things start down the wrong path and eventually end up in these situations where they commit some sort of harm. Yeah. It's their only avenue for release, is what they think.
Can I speak
totally.
to that idea about
that's awesome.
That idea about that it needs to start at the home, and I totally agree. And probably all of us sitting here,
of course,
have the skills to teach our kids those things.
Of course.
What I've seen, though, as being a volunteer in the school a lot, is that there are a whole lot of parents out there who they don't have those skills.
I agree.
And you can't teach what you don't know. So we have to, there definitely is a segment of the population who has the ability to have that start at home. But we need to go beyond that, and that can't be the answer, the only answer, because the schools need to be involved because they're the ones who have contact with all of these kids. We need like 10 times more counselors in our schools to be supporting our kids. We need smaller class sizes so that our individual teachers don't have 30 and 35 children that they're responsible for, that they can make those personal connections, because that's what makes a difference to kids, is the personal connections, the adults that care about them, and knowing that there's adults that care about them. That's what's going to make a difference.
Yeah. Can I also just, I mean, I appreciate the sentiment that we all need to maybe do more at home, or that there's a lot of things that we can do other than gun control. But my question would be, is why is America so different from other countries that do have more gun control, more gun regulations, and where there are not as many guns, we don't see as much gun violence? And that, I have to say, I'm unconvinced that we can't talk about guns. I'm a little frustrated. I realize that the gun itself is not standing up and shooting people. And that's, I mean, of course not.
Of course.
But with the amount of guns that we seem to be, I mean, the amount of guns that have been purchased in the last 20 years since we were growing up is astronomical in America, where you look at other countries and there are not that many guns and they don't have the same problems. And so I'm not, I think that it's not one solution, but actually having some controls and having, you know, I mean, right now, Montana doesn't share information about mental health with the National Instant Background Check System. And why is that? I mean, I think we'd all agree that somebody that has mental instability shouldn't be shouldn't have a gun. And I think, is it really such a bad idea not to let 18-year-olds have guns? I think, you know, I mean, yes, they're voting away a right, but I think that it's interesting that they're willing to vote away that right. I mean, I think that they also realize that they're 18 years old. That doesn't make them, that doesn't give them a lot of life experience. I mean, I don't think it's unreasonable. So I appreciate all of these other things that we can do. I really do. But I do think we have to address guns.
I know, Randy, you wanted to comment on that?
Well, I just wanted to say his first question was, why is America different? And because America is different than any other country on the earth. And that our history is founded in using guns to create our own country. And so we have that history built into our DNA. And as the Australian Prime Minister who was in charge when they confiscated all the guns, and he stated the other day that he didn't think that gun confiscation or changing the gun regulations in the United States as they did in Australia would work, because they have different history. They were a penal colony. They didn't have the historical use and integration of guns in their society. The one thing that I do question is when we start talking about other countries have lower gun violence. Well, Switzerland has almost 100% gun ownership, and they have one of the lowest gun violences in the world. So it's not the number of guns or how many people own them. It's really a societal issue, and I think that's why people who are pro-gun get frustrated when we talk, it's got to be the gun, it's got to be the gun. But a kid could load up a car with lots of other things. The explosives in this package bombing were purchased at Home Depot. If you want to do bad, you will do bad independent of the tool. And we have seen that time and time again. I always try to tell people the history of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. They didn't have guns. They bombed all over the place and killed lots of people without any guns. That was their form of violence. So focusing on the gun or gun control, I think, is wrong. And one of the other things that I have a problem with is to say that the kids want to vote away this right to the gun. Not all of them do. This is a right. So just because 50% or even 70% do you get to trample the other 30% of the people's rights because 50 or 70%? We don't live in a democracy. We live in a republic. We have rights that are stated in the Constitution. And for one segment to just say, well, this group shouldn't have those rights is just, in my opinion, is just wrong.
Yeah. Anyone else have anything to add to that? I think the discussion is going.
I think when you look at the stats, and we can crunch numbers until the cows come home, as they say, but if you look at polling and so on, between 40 and 45% of this country are gun owners. So that's anywhere from 100 to 160 million people. And when you look at the amount of actual gun deaths that are happening, since Sandy Hook, for example, somewhere around 4,000 children killed by guns, violence. Of those 4,000, less than 10% were done with a rifle. Of the rifles used, only 10 of them were done with any of the guns that are actually being proposed to be banned. So what would the gun control laws that are being proposed actually change? The majority of those, 90% of those gun deaths were done with pistols. So, as you keep saying, there are evil people, and if you're going to do harm, you're going to find a way to do it. I've been shooting competition, protection-wise, hobby-wise, hunting-wise, for well over 30 years. I've never had one accident. My children, under the age, they're single digits, they own 2 rifles apiece. Not one accident. And I have absolutely no problem posting pictures of their accolades on the range and hunting and so on. And that's because they've gone through years of training before they were ever allowed to pick up a gun. They were taught the mechanics, they were taught the nomenclature, they were taught the complete breakdown of a weapon before they were ever allowed to even touch one. So I think if we did, and I'm not trying to trample on any opinions or any beliefs. You know, there are members of my own family who feel very strongly that gun control needs to be a topic and needs to be discussed. But when we get into laws like California, child support has to be current before you're allowed to even apply for a permit to purchase a gun. Your registration of your car has to be current before you can apply. We've gotten a little off track with some of these proposed laws. So if you want to attack the problem, I completely agree, and I believe that there is a problem and it needs to be addressed. Going after a certain type of weapon, claiming that this is going to cure the problem. You know, the Aurora shooting, that poor guy went past 17 different theaters before he targeted that one theater, and that's because that theater had a sign that says, "No firearms allowed," and went in and did mass damage. So I believe in concealed weapons laws, and if you look at the statistics on states that do pass concealed weapons laws, for example, the crime rate goes down. Nobody wants to rob the little old lady of her purse because she might be holding a .38 in there. And just for the deterrent purposes, those laws work. May not work in every situation, or it may not work in every state, and that's what we need to address. What is right for the environment in which you're trying to enact the laws for? The same laws that apply in North Dakota and Montana probably wouldn't work for Chicago or Detroit, but some of the most stringent laws hasn't prevented anything from there. So I think there is definitely a problem, but I think attacking certain types of weapons or instituting more infringement on that right isn't going to cure the problem entirely. Like I said, it's a multifaceted issue.
I believe it's a place to start, however.
It is.
It's a place to start. It may not fix everything, it may not end every mass shooting in every high school across the nation, or elementary is such a case, but it's a place to start. And to go back to your, you know, maybe 50% of the students are willing to say, I don't need a gun until I'm 21. But that is the country that we live in. You know, I may not have voted for the president or the governor, but majority of the people did. So he's our president. You know, I mean, so that's not exactly accurate. So there may be, you know, 50 or 70% of the students that are saying, I'm not ready for a gun. I'll wait till I'm 21. The other 30% are going to have to live with the choice that all the other students have made. That's kind of my response to it.
And speaking about laws, so the background check law that was brought up is a really good case in point. So we have a law that says that, you know, major retailers have to do background checks, or I'm not exactly sure what the language is, but that's what it boils down to here in Montana. You know, you go into Cabela's, you're going to have a background check done. You want to buy a gun on the internet or from a private dealer, no background check. I think that that's a law that we can look at and say, well, if background checks are good in one instance, why aren't they good across the board? So let's make them across the board. Universal background checks. Everyone who is going to buy a weapon should, you know, we should check them out, make sure that it's okay. And I'm not worried about people, law-abiding citizens, owning their weapons. My father was a card-carrying member of the NRA for years, and that's not the problem. We need to remove the loopholes in the background check law and maybe consider a red flag warning. That could have picked up the Las Vegas shooter. The number of weapons that he purchased in a short amount of time is kind of sickening. It seems like that should have checked a box somewhere that, that would have warned law enforcement that he was planning something.
So we talk about, I know you kind of mentioned, and you mentioned there's these different, we go back to, bring it back to, you know, local here in schools, and we have students who, like you said, some wanted to do the walkout, some didn't, some want to maybe waive away their right of owning a gun until they're 21, maybe some don't. I guess as parents then, how do you, I mean, if this is, if it starts in the home, right, is this kind of a reoccurring theme? If it starts in the home, how do you start to address these issues when it's not even figured out yet? Does that make sense? When like there isn't an answer. So how do you try to explain to your kid like there isn't an answer, we're still working on it, you know?
I would kind of like to start with that because, as I mentioned before, I have twin daughters and they are very opposite. So I had one participate in the walkout last week and one chose not to. The one that chose not to is also the hunter. My other daughter's a vegetarian. So like I said, they're very opposite. But we have open communications. I chose not to let her have her gun, her hunting rifle at my house. It's at her. She has one at her dad's and she has one at my parents'. I'm certainly okay with her going hunting. I don't fear for that. Her sister doesn't care about that either. My oldest son, he has a pistol and a hunting rifle as well. But we just have open dialogue. It's about respecting. You know, they can have a communication, you know, a conversation between the two of them, the two sisters, and they can have their disagreement, but they respect each other. And I think it does start in the home, and that's, you know, just kind of a prime example. You know, the same thing in the schools. Their friends may not agree. Their friends may be upset because they can't have their hunting rifle in their truck to go after school. They have to stop at home first. But it has to start with a conversation and teaching kids how to respect one another and understand that they're not always going to have their feelings aren't always going to be met, and what their wishes aren't always going to be met, and just kind of figuring out how to deal with that and respecting one another. And I would hope that the school would kind of follow that as well. You know, I know for Big Fork there was a small amount of students that participated in the walkout. I think I read 32. And some of the other larger, you know, schools had more and some had less. And it was really unfortunate to see how the other students that chose not to participate in it treated those that did. You know, there was Instagram memes kind of making fun of them. There was Snapchat videos, you know, which is really disappointing. So I would hope that the parents of those students and the school in general could come together and say, you don't have to agree with these students that chose to do that, but let's be respectful of them just as they would respect you to not participate.
We also got a lot of people that came to us saying that they felt that there was just this pressure for students to take part in the walkout. And I know that that might not be the case for any of you guys, but there was, from some of the reports we got or emails we got from parents, there was a lot of pressure from teachers and other kids for their kids to do the walkout. And then that led to the question, well, if they don't know why they're walking out and if they don't agree with it, then why should they have to? Anyone have that similar?
Well, the very original walkout, which I think was February 21st, my daughter's a competitive shooter, so obviously she is pro-gun, and she was not interested in the walkout because she didn't believe that it was really well thought out and what they, you know, knew what they were walking out for. But she tried to address it in class because her teacher at the time was promoting the walkout and was walking out with kids. And so she asked questions about, you know, the teacher was addressing your First Amendment rights to, you know, protest. And she asked about Second Amendment rights and how the teacher thought about that. And the teacher just ignored her, did not want to have that conversation. And that was frustrating for my daughter because she was engaging in the conversation on First Amendment, she was engaging on the conversation of the walkout, but when it came to conversation about the Second Amendment, which she felt strongly about, she was just ignored. It wasn't part of the conversation, and she was not trying to belittle anybody. She just wanted to have a discussion about that as part of, you know, if we're going to be walking out for this, let's have that discussion. So consequently, the second walkout, the teacher was a different teacher, and that teacher was basically, you know, saying, we're going to be doing math in here. If you want to walk out and you feel strongly about it, walk out. Otherwise, you stay here and do math. It was that simple, and the teacher just removed themselves from it. So there's, you know, people on both sides of the debate all over. You don't expect teachers to not have political opinions, you know, either. But it's not just kids that need to respect other people's opinions, but the teachers need to respect that as well and understand that there are kids with varying opinions on all of it.
How do you get to the point where you guys can, as a group that maybe disagrees how that action needs to happen, how do you get to a point where you guys can make action happen by at least conversing and starting a dialogue?
I would say and it's taken a lot of practice. Like I said, my girls will be 18 next week. So it's taken a lot of practice, but they have learned just to show that they're friends that are on the opposite sides, what they do have in common with things. My one daughter is a little bit more, she considers herself a socialist, I will use her words. So she was having a dialogue with one of her best friends who is extremely on the right side, and she said, you agree with me on that. you know, it wasn't the way she presented, it was the way my daughter heard it, and she said, oh, you're right, we do agree on that. So just having that conversation and learning that you're not going to agree on everything, but let's find things that we do have in common, which will help. You know, they're able to come together and say, okay, we don't agree on the president right now, but we can agree on this aspect of it, and that's where it starts for adults, for students, you know, for parents. It was pretty disappointing for me to see just the parents that were commenting, you know, for the different news articles that were out during the walkout. I was very, very disappointed, and some of those people were my friends, and I was reading their comments saying, do you realize that you were saying that about my child, you know, my child, because she participated. Yeah. But I think that a lot of parents don't necessarily think that. They think their child didn't do it, wouldn't do it, but it's, if you kind of try to come back together and find those commonalities, like I know my friends love my daughter, you know, so think about that through their perspective.
I just think that's one of the dangers of social media, and I don't post on social media because people are so removed from the face-to-face contact, they say things that they wouldn't normally say. So to get back to your original, you know, because the comments on social media go both ways, and it's hard to have open discourse when you're pro-gun and you're compared to Nazis or you're compared to, you know, murderers. So the most important thing in the discussion is to, you know, tell your kids that it's not just about voicing your opinion, it's to listening to other people's opinion as well. You have to be able to be a good listener to really be able to compromise or come to solutions. And so if you're just adamantly opposed to somebody and not listening to anything they say, you're not going to take anything good out of what they say. But if you're open to listening to what people have to say, then you can hopefully come to some common ground. And you have to do that in discussion with your kids. That's how your kids learn that.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about just those critical thinking skills of, well, you know, when we read something, we look at that, well, is this a good argument? Is their premise something that you can agree with or that it makes sense to start with? And are the conclusions that they drew from that premise valid? You see a lot of the arguments on social media are just these crazy, you know, jump from one topic all the way over to the other end. And I think more of us are in the middle than what it seems like, because the conversations that are happening in the media and on social media are so polarized, and probably a lot more of us who are able to come to some compromise are the ones who are not involved in that fray.
Yeah. Well, and that being said, I mean, we talk about polarization, but what would you like to see from your local leaders, your local government, our senators, our even just here in town, our school administrators? I mean, even at that level, I feel like it's so polarized right now in a way that even our local government is having a hard time getting to an agreement on, I mean, other issues besides this. But I mean, even just having the conversation amongst themselves. I mean, what would you like to see from our government?
I've spoken to actually candidates. This is an election year up in Polson for sheriff and other positions, right up to judges and so on. So I've been talking to them, just trying to figure out, as part of my decision-making paradigm, to figure out who to vote for. I don't go right or total left. Who aligns best with what I feel the community or myself or my family needs? And that could be on either side of the aisle. It's whoever's got my best interests in mind is who I vote for. And I've seen a completely, I hate to keep using polarized, but it's a complete difference of opinion from both sides, just in the sheriff race alone. So I like some of the ideas of one candidate, and I don't like some of the ideas from another. But they both bring up valid points. So, you know, our running sheriff right now that has been in office, I've worked with him for years, I've known him for years. One of the candidates running against him has some very proactive ideas to help, and our SROs at our schools are under the sheriff's department, so that's why I took a keen interest in talking to them. And they have completely opposing views. And I tell my 11-year-old, who's just now getting into the sort of social media aspects of going to the middle school and more social, higher friend total, so to speak, and a larger group of people that she normally hangs out with, I tell them, you need to just inform yourself. be as informed as you possibly can. Make the best decision for you. And she's very social, so she gets opinions from and outlooks from multiple different avenues. And it's the same thing I do when looking at who to vote for. Just go out and seek out the information. Form your own decision. And I told her, as far as the walkout was concerned, if you feel you want to walk out, that's fine. I said, but my question to you is, why are you walking out? And if it's for the students, can you name one? You know, how informed are you? And anybody and everybody I spoke to that day as far as the walkout, couldn't name one student that passed away, not one. I said, so if you're going out for the 17 minutes to memorialize these students, it would help to know who you're walking out for. And we didn't have one walkout at the middle school, for example. I think we had maybe 30 students at the high school, and that was it for 17 minutes. And it wasn't very heated, but I know on social media, again, we keep going back to it, that there was plenty of comments on both sides of the aisle, people that were opposing, people that were for it. And I certainly wasn't objective to memorializing those students, absolutely, but have a purpose. Know why you're doing it.
Yeah.
And that's why I tell them, just get as informed as you can, even at her age.
It's 4:01, so I just want to ask one more question, and each of you can answer, we can discuss this. I guess, what have you taken away from just being able to sit? I went through and I was making sure that I was getting people who had different thoughts and different opinions, because I wanted to see if there was a way, because we read the comments too. We read them and we know what is being said. And a lot of the times it's frustrating on our end as well, because we kind of just get, like, I feel like it was frustrating for me because I wanted to create a constructive talk. And that's why I wanted this to come together, is because I wanted to create a constructive talk. And do you feel like something like this needs to happen more with your communities? I mean, is it the community's responsibility to get rational people to sit down and talk?
Absolutely. I think that's great, and I'm really glad that you did this. I think that, as was said earlier, if we can find common ground, and I think we could all sit here and find something that we have in common, even though we have difference of opinions, that goes a long way, and just that personal contact is critical. We're all often kind of in our own silos, so doing more events like this would be a great idea.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
And I think historically, I mean, that's as you and I talked originally, this is a problem that is so multifaceted,
Yep.
but probably the lack of community is probably one of the biggest aspects of it. As our societies get bigger and bigger, the communities tend to disappear, and we're all individualized. You know, our kids don't play out in the streets together with all the kids that we used to when they were growing up, and we're all running different directions, and the automobile has got us driving 30 miles away for something that we used to do within our own little neighborhood. And so these types of community discussions may be a step towards bringing those communities back together and seeing what your neighbor thinks, and trying to, you know, have a civil discussion and come to some kind of conclusion. Yeah, you know, reinvigorating the community is definitely always a good thing.
Yeah, and I think that was something that I was interested in, is just to see what the parents who are dropping their kids off at school, and they're the ones who are having to navigate this conversation and these types of issues in their homes. So I really appreciate you guys coming here. And if you guys have anything else that maybe I didn't ask, or maybe you wanted to just quickly say that maybe I missed.
I want to say thanks for having us, and thanks for coming up with the idea. Personally, I appreciate that you know, come up with this idea and thought it was worthy, and you know, obviously we all thought it was worthy as well. So it was a good idea.
Well, thank you.
That's great.
Thank you very much, Ken. I think it was definitely something that it does need to happen. And this is something that's been taken away due to social media and everybody having the guts to say something on social media, but never face to face. I think everybody here is in agreement on a lot of different things. I think we have different views on things, but I think we all have the same goal in mind, and it's the safety of the kids and our environments and our communities. I think that's the commonality that I know we all share, and I think more of this does need to happen at a community, or even, you know, local, state government, however you want to, whatever level you want to call it. But I think the discussions do need to happen, and they do need to happen in forums like this, or even bigger.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Well, thank you guys for coming. Appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Yeah.
It's nice to meet you.
And you as well. Thank you guys
Good.
for all coming out.